to disrupt sleep, obviously, from an economic development perspective, in terms of trying to activate housing in the downtown. Train whistles can be an issue. And I think as well as related to the business development and the business community in the downtown, this has been an issue that's been discussed for a long time. It's been in the works here for quite a long time, and we think we're close now to at least maybe seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, as they say in train talk.
A little train talk there. This is a process, though, Larry, isn't it?
It certainly is. Yeah, there's a lot of nuts and a lot of bolts that go into this thing. And as Ted said, we've been working pretty diligently the last year and a half and interacting with regulatory agencies like the Federal Railroad Administration, and then large stakeholders, the folks that are right next to the tracks. The entire process really is an exercise in reducing risk. And if the city can demonstrate sufficiently that we've reduced the risk to a level that's lower than the risk when the trains are normally sounding their horns, then we can implement the quiet zone.
Well, you raise a good point. They sound their horns and whistles for a reason, that is to alert you they're coming, because you can't stop a train like you can stop a car.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing that may still occur on occasion is if a locomotive engineer sees something that perhaps there's construction in close proximity to a crossing, they still have a requirement to sound a certain series of horns to let the contractors know, hey, we're on our way. If they see somebody, walking on the tracks, they would sound it. But the consistent day in, day out sounding of train horns would cease upon the implementation of the quiet zone.
All right. And so that does raise a thought about safety at all, a concern?
Well, it really shouldn't.
Okay.
I understand how people might think, okay, we're not going to hear the train. The gates all have minimum requirements, and so the bells, the ding, ding, ding bells, and the red flashing lights and the arms are going to go down, and then additional safety devices will be put into place. And what you might see is a non-traversable, like a 6-9-inch curb in the center of the road that would prevent somebody from driving around that gate. Or you might see 4 gates instead of 2 gates.
I see.
And so there's about 5 treatments that the FRA will allow you to do. One of those that is closures as well, and we're looking at a potential for 3 crossing closures.
Closures as in permanent closures. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, there's no safer scenario at a rail crossing.
Yes, not right.
A permanent closure, and I mean, obviously, we try to be strategic about that. We're not going to, obviously close high traffic areas, but those areas where there is less traffic impact, where we can improve, as Larry indicated, basically our safety rating by eliminating risk. We're going to take advantage of that. So there's a combination of infrastructure improvements that will occur here differently at different crossings. In some instances, we are talking about closures. In some instances, we're talking about what Larry has already mentioned, either non-traversable curbs or quad gates. But again, I think the bottom line is to recognize that the reason trains sound their horns is because we have minimum safety standards in place.
Got it.
If we increase the safety standards are in place, then there's less of a necessity to sound horns.
Interesting. We'll pick up on this conversation coming up in just a minute. 8:14 WBCK. We're talking today with Ted Deering, Assistant City Manager in Battle Creek, and Larry Bowron, Director of Transportation, talking about quiet trains. And, we were joking a little about it, the notion that if you live near a train track, you'd like them not to sound that horn early in the morning or the middle of the night. But there is a lot of consideration about this. And, Larry, you referred before the break there to those close to these areas, industry, we presume, mostly business, who might say, hey, wait a minute, I got to get through there. And so these are considerations, right?
That's right, Richard. It was interesting as we went out and met with stakeholders. We had a lot of different stories, but in almost all cases, the folks that worked in and around these crossings were so excited about the potential to bring that ambient noise level of their workplace down to something that was more reasonable. We're talking about 110 decibels at the crossing, and the noise doesn't drop off that quickly. So it's a fairly large footprint in terms of noise. And a lot of these trains, particularly the freight trains, they pass through town between 8 o'clock at night and maybe 3 in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Right. So these are times when you'd rather not hear that.
That's right.
So, Ted, you're in the business of working on economic development in downtown, and so when we tell people, yeah, the trains are quiet in these hours, does that make a difference for some folks?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I mean, you look at the hotel, for example, McKinley Plaza Hotel, and it has become a habit of theirs to, put people on certain sides of the hotel, put them on the north-facing side as opposed to the south-facing side in order to try to avoid some of that problem. But you can't take a facility like that and say, hey, you can only use 50% of your rooms.
Sure, right.
And Larry talked about it. I mean, as we've visited stakeholders like Community Action, for example, located, almost on top of the train tracks, and we could barely get through a conversation with them without having trains go by and horns go off.
Wow.
Very disruptive to their business. And so it is certainly going to be an advantage, and as we mentioned a little bit at the beginning of the show, too, that in terms of trying to bring residential online, and we've got a lot of units that are proposed at this point, particularly in the downtown, that it'll be a critical factor in making that a desirable place to live.
So do we look upon this as modernizing downtown, or is this something new that is on the cutting edge of train travel in the United States?
I would say that this really complements what the work that's been accomplished downtown.
Yeah.
In terms of being new cutting edge, there are a lot of communities that are now exploring this concept of a quiet zone.
I'll bet.
I would say in Michigan, we're probably the first community to take a look at such a large line of rail. It's about 11 crossings, and but it's not unusual. Back in Illinois, west of town, I'm aware of several quiet zones. They may consist of 1 or 2 crossings, and they're typically located near a school or perhaps an assisted living facility. But I think this is going to complement all the work that the city has done downtown and in Battle Creek really well.
All right, and in a minute, we'll talk about how you pay for all that, and we'll discover what is being done in that regard in just a couple of minutes here on WBCK 8. Good morning, WBCK. We're here with Ted Deering and Larry Bowron from the city of Battle Creek. We're talking about quiet trains. Somebody out there listening is saying, how are we going to pay for all this? So how are we?
Well, when we issued capital bonds, about 2.5 years ago now, we included this project because it had been in the planning phases for numerous years, and we had not necessarily had a funding mechanism for it. We had an opportunity here, so we included it as part of that bond issue, and have been anticipating doing this again now for a couple of years.
All right, so how much money are we talking about here to do this?
The original bond was about $3.2 million, and that's what we determined to be a baseline budget based on a study done in 2010. Now, however, in discussions with the state and the railroads, there are incentives, and the incentives are for closures. These closures are, as Ted mentioned, such an effective way to mitigate risk that the railroads absolutely love them. And, of course, the 2 lines that we're working with are Grand Trunk, Canadian National, and then what used to be Norfolk Southern, now owned by the state of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an important part of their plan for accelerated rail between Detroit and Chicago. And so the incentive program for closures, with the 3 enclosures that we have, you can get a certain amount of money if you close 1 crossing. You can get a little more if you close 2, et cetera. And so we're looking at a little over $500,000 in incentive costs or incentives that we can put right back into the Quiet Zone project.
Interesting. So, yeah, if you look at it from the railroad point of view, they want probably as few crossings as possible because that means less potential to run into something.
That's right. Yep. And we've learned a lot in partnering with them. We've learned about some of these radiuses and even in some cases some buildings that obstruct signals. And so what they've explained to us is the train, whether it's passenger or freight, has to slow down until they get around this corner. Then the locomotive engineer can see the signal, and then he can resume his speed.
Right.
So we learned a lot, and it really has turned out to a partnership between the state and the railroads and the city.
Interesting.
I mean, we recognize. I mean, in the railroads world, they probably would have closed all 11 crossings and been happy with that. Obviously, we're concerned about traffic flow in our community, and only targeted crossings or potential closures where there were very low volumes of traffic.
I see. I see. Well, and if you're a motorist, you'd almost like the railroad to build a bridge and put the train up there, so you wouldn't be stopped at all. But I guess that's not realistic.
Well,
either.
we've done that once or twice, and it costs a little bit more than $3.5 million.
I'll bet it does, yeah. So let's talk about downtown development for a second, if we might, in the time we have left. There's been some chatter that Heritage Tower is trucking along, and how are you feeling about that project today?
I'm feeling good about that project. We had a very important meeting on Friday, as a matter of fact, with 616 and their entire development team, including both the financial side of the operation and their community development team, with a potential funder who would be the last piece in the puzzle in putting this thing together. And I felt it was a very good meeting. I think all parties came out very optimistic about where we are. We still have to get over this last hump. But they're very excited. They are very anxious to go on this project. And again, as they did recently, reiterated their 100% commitment to seeing this thing go forward.
Mm-hmm. And in that regard, we're still talking about mixed use, that is to say, some retail, some residential.
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit of commercial space, a little bit of retail space, and a lot of residential. And they're looking at it from the perspective of how can this building service the community as well. So they're even talking about some innovative approaches to using the old dome space, perhaps as potentially incubator space, and other options that would give the public an opportunity to take advantage of this, this tremendous facility in the downtown.
When we're talking about a building of this age, are there modern considerations that have to be taken into place when you're making it a building where work takes place and residences will be held?
I mean, obviously, technology, infrastructure is a big issue. The building, it's a good building. It's a very solid structure, but realistically, and part of what's taking a long time to get this development online is that they basically, as they say, have to take it down to the studs in this particular instance in order to make it a modern office and residential complex. So, there are some challenges that add a lot of cost, but ultimately, it's doable, assuming we can get the finances in place.
Mm-hmm. And someone obviously feels that it is doable, and there's potential for everybody to come out with a few dollars in their pocket out of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. These types of buildings, they require some incentives to move forward. Usually the cost to develop a building like this and then what it's worth when you're done in the short term, those things don't usually add up. Right. And so it requires some incentive to get it done. But long term, particularly as it relates to that building being a catalyst for other development in the downtown, while the building itself will probably take a long time to realize a return on investment, the downtown will not. Mm-hmm. It will drive a lot of development, and with these folks, 616 being in essence the first to market, they're going to be the catalyst that really helps turn the downtown around.
Do you have interest from folks who say, if that building goes online, then I'm going to be right behind somewhere nearby?
We do hear that all the time,
really?
Both from existing business owners who probably would love to expand given the opportunity and those who would consider developments in the downtown.
Very interesting. Well, we'll be thrilled to talk more about this when you can. Meanwhile, Larry, when do we start fixing up these railroad crossings?
Well, we have a notice of intent that we filed with the Federal Railroad Administration. There's a 60-day comment period, and that 60-day comment period ends March 15th. Okay. So while that is taking place, we're working on design documents, bid documents, agreements with the railroad to reimburse them for their share of the work. And if everything comes together, we'd like to bid the project, at least our improvements that the city's responsible for, May, June, and have those improvements done by the fall. And we're working pretty intensely with the railroads. The railroads have a very heavy work schedule. They have some congressional mandates for work that they need to complete, and so we're trying to get in our schedule, and things are looking pretty good for having the project done by the end of this fiscal year.
Well, that'd be the right weather window, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sure.
You'd be working out there in the wintertime. All right, well, we'll stay in touch on all of these issues and come back anytime you like.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Richard.
Thanks very much, Larry Bowron, Ted Deering, City of Battle Creek, 820.